Welcome to the Kevin Bass Show long form podcast. If you have an idea that you take from this podcast that you want to apply to your own life, you should always talk to your doctor before doing so and never construe anything you hear as medical advice. And with that, enjoy the Kevin Bass Show. Hey, everybody. In this podcast, we're going to watch a clip by Andy Galpin where he argues that the deadlift is not inherently dangerous. I believe that his arguments actually show that the deadlift is inherently dangerous. I'm not going to add much additional content. I'm just going to ask you to think about what Andy says in a particular kind of way, and maybe you agree with me. This is my core argument for why the deadlift is dangerous, and Andy is going to make it for me. Let's watch the clip.
There are no good or bad exercises. There's only good or bad application. Here's a great example of that, right? So you do not get hurt deadlifting because deadlifts are dangerous. You only get hurt deadlifting because you either got in bad position, you got in bad position because you either started in bad position, which is one of the things you just said, or you ended up in bad position. You did too much volume, you did too much intensity, or you did too much complexity. Those last three things all hurt you because they result in the first one, which is out of position. Or another way to think about this, if it's not a visible change in position, is stress got put into a part of the system that should not absorb that much stress. So you did too much of it. You did it too heavy. You got fatigued, so you broke position. You got too heavy, so you broke position. You made the exercise too complex. You put too many moving parts in it. You put too many joints in it, and you got out of position. You did that too many times. Over time, now we've led to either an acute injury, bam, back pops and you fall on the floor, or just like, man, this thing is hurting over time. All these are a result of the same thing. So you cannot ever blame the exercise for causing the problem. It's always either the user or the coach. You programmed way too much here and I can't handle that position, or you yourself went into it too much. So if you're getting these little tweaks and problems going on, you've made an error in one of those things. So simply back off.
There's a lot going on in this argument that Andy's making. There's several different layers of analysis. I'm going to start out with the most obvious. And by way of analogy, I want to make my point. So let's start by talking about a gun. A gun doesn't shoot anybody. People, right, shoot people using the gun. Let's say, though, that you have the gun and you have a 5-year-old boy or girl. So let's say it's a boy. You have a 5-year-old boy. That boy likes guns. Obviously, you don't want your 5-year-old boy to get a hold of the gun. So what you do is you put the magazine for the gun in one box, and you put the gun in another box, and you put them both in two separate locations. Furthermore, for extra security, just in case your boy finds the magazine and then finds the gun and then puts them together and then has a dangerous weapon on their hands, you lock the box, but you also remove the trigger of the gun. You take it out of the gun, making it so that you have to reassemble the gun in order to shoot it. So you have a box that's hidden away, 2 boxes hidden away, 2 separate locations. Each of these are locked. One contains the ammunition, one contains the gun. The gun itself has no trigger. It needs to be reassembled with the trigger. It's clearly a task the 5-year-old cannot handle. And furthermore, the key is around your neck. So there's no way that the kid is getting the gun and the ammo, loading the gun with the ammo, and then using it on other people or on himself by accident. As we know, dozens of people every year, dozens of children every year are shot and killed They shoot themselves or they shoot each other on accident with guns that they find. So that's not going to happen in your case. Your situation with the gun is completely 100% safe. But what has that just shown? Does that show that it's not the gun that's dangerous, it's the use of the gun? No. All of those precautions that you've taken in order to make the gun safe prove that the gun is inherently dangerous. There are different objects that in different contexts have a different level of dangerousness associated with them. Cotton candy might be able to kill people through some sorts of means and mechanisms if you're very creative or very unlucky. Hopefully not creative. But if you're very unlucky, perhaps you can die eating cotton candy. But that's a very special, unique situation. With a gun, however, the purpose of the gun is to kill, or at least to wound. It doesn't require a special circumstance in order for that to happen. It's easy for that to happen. So we can say that the gun is inherently more dangerous than the cotton candy. The cotton candy can be made dangerous in certain contexts. Let's say you ball it up into a tiny little amount and very compact, and then you feed it to a toddler on accident, clearly. Then it can become dangerous. But a gun needs special circumstances, not in order to make it dangerous, but a gun needs special circumstances in order to make it safe. A gun is inherently dangerous. If you need all of these different things, the correct biomechanics, the correct positioning, the correct amount of volume, the correct amount of training intensity, the correct amount of complexity with your deadlifts, what you've shown with that abundance of precaution that you need in each and every specific way that you use the lift, he listed 4 different ways. If you need all 4 of those in order to rest assured that the deadlift is safe, then the deadlift is inherently dangerous. Think about that again. If you need all sorts of different kinds of controls over the way that you're lifting in order to make a lift safe, what you're doing is inherently dangerous, but it's been made safe through multiple different layers of control. Let's go back to the gun analogy to take this argument further. At 5 years old, that child is very safe in that situation. But imagine that child ages, and instead of being 5, it's now 15. That's 10 years that have passed, 10 years for that child to have learned through hearsay. Somebody during some Christmas dinner talked about the gun. The father brought the gun out at one point, and the child saw roughly where the father went to go get the gun, went to go get the magazine. But the father didn't think that it was such a big deal because, he had the key around his neck and things are safe. And so they may have roughly found the hiding place, but they still can't use the gun. And they also need to assemble the trigger. But imagine you have this 15-year-old boy who now knows where the gun is, has an idea that key is how to get the gun, and has access to Google and knows how to assemble a trigger. And suddenly, that gun, which was very safe, in the 5-year-old's case, is no longer as safe. In the 15-year-old's case, the 15-year-old can wait until the necklace is off, or the father can remove the necklace at some point, take the necklace, take the key, and get the gun. If that 15-year-old boy is so motivated. It's no longer as safe. Conditions have changed. Let's switch back to the case of the deadlifts. Let's say you control perfectly all these variables that you need in order to not get injured on the deadlift, and you're perfectly okay. But let's say you do the deadlift 20 times, over the course of 20 years. Let's say you do it once a week for 20 years. That's 52 weeks in a year. That's 52 times a year times 20, which is 1,040 times. You do the deadlift 1,040 times, where you're controlling the positioning perfectly, you're controlling the volume perfectly, you're controlling the intensity perfectly, and you're controlling the complexity perfectly. What are the odds that in 1,040 times you get everything right? Let's add to this a little bit more. When you do it 1,040 times, you're also trying to grow. You're trying to use it to progress in your strength. That means you're pushing yourself a little bit. What are the chances that you're going to get the volume right, the intensity right, the complexity right, and the positioning right when you're working your butt off to get bigger and stronger, and you're pushing it sometimes? What are the chances that you're going to get it right every single time? Let's add to this even more. Do we know for each person what that level of intensity, volume, and complexity is to prevent injury? No. There's no way that you can know for yourself exactly what that level is. And so you're going to be pushing yourself. How do you know that you're pushing yourself enough to grow and get stronger? And how do you know if you're pushing yourself too much? That's very hard. I would say that's impossible, or quite close to it. Let's take it even further. Many people learn about deadlifts on the internet, social media, lifting magazines, lifting websites. Sometimes all they get is basic instructions about the form. Lift hard, and they get a lot of information. Some people have done the deadlift every day. There are some prominent examples on the internet of people who do the deadlift every single day, and they tell you it's perfectly fine. What are the chances in those cases that everybody's going to get things right with the volume, the intensity, the complexity, and the positioning? 0. People are going to get hurt because they're using an inherently dangerous lift that requires a lot of control in order to prevent injury. And they're doing it without a lot of coaching. And even if they have coaching, it's hard to get things right. The deadlift is a powerful tool, like a gun. The deadlift, like a gun, is extremely powerful. And so if you use it enough, the deadlift in this case, guns are another matter. But if you use the deadlift enough, it's hard to gauge and assess how to be perfectly safe. Let's take it a step further. If you watch the video again, you'll see something very funny happened when he talks about this. He talks about the positioning, then he talks about the volume, intensity, and complexity. And he says it's those latter 3 that cause the positioning to go out of whack. But then he qualifies. And this is where his explanation is quite interesting. He qualifies, and then he says it doesn't necessarily have to be a visible positioning, but it could just be some stress that's too heavy on one particular part of the body. It's almost like positioning has changed and is off, but it's actually not necessarily that positioning is off. It's as if positioning is off, because one part of the body is too stressed. If you pay close attention to that explanation, it's quite interesting because it suggests that there's an entirely different explanation than positioning. Or that positioning fundamentally works to cause injury via this other mechanism, which is to say, causing undue stress on the body, on one particular place of the body, which then gets injured. But this undue stress on the body, which can then get injured, isn't necessarily always caused by bad positioning. It could be caused just by doing too much volume, intensity, complexity, etc. Why do I say could? Well, the thing that's very interesting here is that there's actually a big controversy in the field of biomechanics and injury prevention using the deadlift and using the squat. The controversy is what causes injury. Some people believe that it's not necessarily even positioning at all or technique at all. In fact, there's a big, strong contingent of people who are making that case very consistently and constantly that positioning is not important for the deadlift or the squat and preventing injury. In fact, other variables are more important. And then there's people on the other end of the spectrum that don't think that volume, intensity, complexity is so important, but rather the different makeup of different kinds of bodies. Some people suggest that it's the different makeup of different kinds of bodies that cause injuries. So some kinds of bodies, because of their leverages and their biomechanics, the femur length, the length of the arms, the length of the torso, etc., they predispose to injury. It's not positioning at all, and it's not form at all. It's just the body's inherent makeup, and it's not volume or intensity at all. It's just certain body shapes shouldn't be using these lifts, which is actually kind of a variant on the positioning argument. It's like an inherent kind of positioning of certain kinds of bodies that can't really be put in the right position, such that they end up with stress and they get injured, which is also very plausible. Let's say some bodies just don't do well in those kinds of positions, and as a result, get injured doing the deadlift. It's completely plausible. And here's where it gets deeper and more interesting. Why is there a debate in the field at all about what causes injuries from the squat and deadlift? Does anybody want to take a guess? The reason is there's no good evidence about what causes injury from the squat and the deadlift, and so it's very controversial. People are arguing about it because there's no good data to resolve the question. So people selectively cite different parts of pieces of information, different pieces of the scientific literature to make different arguments about what causes injuries. And here's what gets more interesting. Andy seemed to vacillate between two different explanations. If you pay very close attention, as I mentioned earlier, he went from the positioning argument to some sort of like excessive stress on one part of the body, which might not necessarily need to visibly be in the wrong position. Right? And that's because the field is unclear. I would suggest that the reason Andy vacillated is because he doesn't exactly know why. He's himself not entirely sure why. And is giving just two different prominent explanations. And here's what I noticed in talking about the squat and deadlift on social media and communicating about it. Everybody was sure that the squat and the deadlift are not the problem. It's the use. But the interesting part is everybody's reasons for why it's the use are different. So some people, again, say biomechanics. Some people say positioning. Some people say excess RPE. Some people say excess volume. Some people say excess intensity. Some people say excess complexity. Some people say genetics. And there's many, many other explanations that people give. But everybody's sure that the squat and the deadlift are safe. And here's where it gets even more interesting. If we don't understand exactly why the squat and the deadlift cause injuries, then how can we control those variables to prevent those injuries? Maybe we can. Maybe some people think they know and maybe they're right. But everybody seems to have a different view of things. Everybody seems to have a different set of explanations and a different set of advice about how to prevent injury. So how do we know which set of advice is correct? I have no idea. And that's assuming, in the first place, that there is some, that's assuming that the original argument is correct in the first place. So here's the overall full argument. Using Andy's examples, Andy's data, Andy's words, and interpreting them. The deadlift requires many different controls, pieces of control, in order to ensure no injury. It's very difficult to know what these pieces of control are. Andy says you should back off once you hit excess volume, intensity, complexity, wrong positioning, and you find yourself getting close to being injured. But Andy offers no way to know where that threshold is over which one steps and thereby causes injury. He offers no guidance whatsoever about that. His theories are potentially even contradictory and certainly are debatable and controversial in the field. And then he says that the coach and the user are responsible for making sure that the deadlift doesn't cause these injuries. But many people, in fact, most people who do deadlifts don't have coaches. And they aren't as well educated as Andy is, assuming that his explanations are correct, which, again, I've said are debatable. And yet we're saying, even though the squat requires all this control that we're not sure what it is, even though it requires a knowledgeable user and coach, and even though we might do it over 1,000 times over the course of 20 years, we're never going to get it wrong. We're never going to cross that threshold. We're never going to have a serious injury. We don't have to worry about having one because we can figure it out ourselves somehow, even without that information ourselves. And we should just mass recommend it to everybody. I think that's fucking insane. That's fucking crazy to me. Pardon my French, I have no idea why anybody thinks that makes any sense at all. The very arguments that many people make about the squat and the deadlift for why they're safe are demonstrations to me that these movements are not safe without some serious consideration. Maybe, in some cases, if you have a good coach or an incredibly knowledgeable user, somebody who's responsible, maybe. But I can conceptualize, I can conceive of, and I know that some strength coaches do, some people who work with backs of elite athletes, in fact, some of the athletes that Andy works with, the same exact athletes, because he's a UFC trainer. I know people who work with the UFC fighters. There's exercises that people can use that are alternatives to the deadlift and squat that achieve much the same training benefit without these risks. Now, if you have elite coaching and all that stuff, great. you're probably a lot safer. But I would still argue you're not risk-free, especially if you're going at that elite level. You're squatting 600 pounds. You're training jujitsu 3 or 4 times a week. You're doing wrestling, which is uncontrolled. How are you going to control that volume? You have a hard training partner that day. You have to have a really good coach, like a really good on-point coach to manage all of that. And the coach may not get it right, even the best coaches in the world. So I would say even with elite athletes, unless you're on the off season, you can control everything. Deadlifting maybe is not such a great idea. Even for elite athletes with the best coaches in the world. And for the general public, again, it strikes me as crazy to recommend this to people who don't have any training or understanding of all this stuff we're talking about. Completely lunatic, like complete madness that we're even having this argument and this discussion. I don't even understand it at all. Now, with that said, if you love deadlifting and you love squatting, nobody can argue with that. Nobody can say don't do it. I do lots of things that are dumb, that are unsafe, because I enjoy them. I train wrestling and jiu-jitsu, and that wrestlers' backs are not great. They're better than those sedentary population, but they're not great. But I love it, and I do it because I love it. But I don't do it because I'm trying to just get fit. If you're just trying to get fit, and if you don't love it, there's no reason to do it. In fact, there's every reason not to do it. It's like having a gun in the house with a 15-year-old. Yeah, maybe it's okay. Probably it's okay. It's almost certainly it's fine. It depends on the 15-year-old, right? It really does. Some 15-year-olds, maybe not. We know that very clearly at this point of the last couple of years, right? We know that. And in those situations, you might want to be safer. And I think in general, with most people, why add that unnecessary risk when you have other movements that are just as good? I think it's convention. And it's kind of an addiction to the rush of training, especially the rush of deadlifting, rush of squatting, having all that weight on your back and pulling all the weight off the ground. It's fun. But it's not the best idea for health and injury prevention. There's one other argument I was going to make, and I may have to do it in my FAQ. So, speaking of which, I do have an FAQ coming up. It's going to cover all of the arguments that people make against my position, including this one, which I think to some people, I think I've persuasively made. To others, you guys will need a little bit more work, and we'll do that work. But the last thing I wanted to say, and it came back to me, was, look, resistance training is one of the best things you can do for your body. One of the best things you can do for your health. One of the best things you can do for your long-term longevity. Like, you really, really need to do resistance training. When you hit around 75, people can really fall off the cliff as far as physical functioning is concerned. And the higher level of physical functioning you have before you hit that level, the better. You shouldn't, simply because you feel some minor discomfort, you shouldn't forego these movements. But if you're having minor discomfort, you might think of alternative movements and then train them very hard also. And then program correctly. And if you have a coach and if you really love these movements, go do it. It's better than being sedentary. Okay? But if you're going to be a fit person pursuing maximum longevity and optimizing your physical performance and you're optimizing your joint health, doing a bunch of 600-pound squats for 20 years may not be the smartest thing in the world. But resistance training is. Do not forego resistance training. That would be a terrible idea. And that's not what I'm saying. And if you think that's what I'm saying, close out the window, unsubscribe, don't talk to me. Like, you're doing a disservice to yourself. Don't use this as an excuse not to train. That's terrible. If you want maximum longevity, hit the weight room 2 or 3 times a week for the rest of your life. At least once a week. Once a week should be actually okay to maintain about six sets per muscle group. Maintain your muscle. Maybe 3 to 6, but closer to 6, you're good. Once a week is fine. But you need to be training at least once a week and probably at least twice or 3 times a week in the gym, your whole body. Okay? And that's how you get maximum longevity. That's how you optimize that. But I do think within that framework, there are ways to optimize things further. And I think many people have the wrong idea. I think many people deadlift when they shouldn't be deadlifting. If that's all they want is to maintain and optimize their longevity, they shouldn't be deadlifting. They shouldn't be squatting. I really do think so, based on the arguments I've made here. I think it's an absurdity that we're having this discussion. If you want to do light deadlifting and light squatting and certain kinds of programming, that starts to make more sense. But like heavy deadlifts, heavy squats, it doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand it based on what I've said here. And go rewatch the video if you're still not convinced. But I think it's crazy that we have to have this discussion. I don't understand why the powerlifting bros are dominating this discussion. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's just totally wrong. And it's like immoral, in my opinion, to be having this debate, and especially for like that viewpoint to be dominant. It's like dominant on online. It's like that everybody should be squatting and deadlifting heavy. It's like, what is wrong with you people? It's just so crazy. But hey, Andy thinks that squats and deadlifts is not a bad movement. He's an Olympic, he's an Olympian trainer. He trains Olympians. He trains UFC fighters, but he doesn't have everything right. I think he's wrong here. So I'm going to disagree with him here. And yeah, check out the FAQ when it comes out. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. Come into my comments and say I'm the worst person in the world. I'm getting that a lot lately. You're just going to be like removed from my channel. Nobody's going to read your comments anymore. I'm going to like hide all your comments from my channel like permanently. So please don't do that. If you want to like keep coming and commenting and having a civil discussion with me, because I'm a smart person and I have things that I can help people with. And that's what I want to do for you guys. I'm passionate about helping you guys about this particular issue because I think it's a really big, important issue, and I'm going to go focus in on it for the next several years. It's going to be an issue I become quite knowledgeable about. I'm talking to some of the leading experts in this area. I keep talking to people. I want to talk with more people. So if you are an expert and you think I'm wrong, like send me a message. If you're Andy, you think I'm wrong, send me a message. Hope you don't hate me for owning you on the interwebs, Andy. But no, I hope we can have differences of opinion. Seriously, because it's ridiculous that that this becomes so heated and emotional, but it is what it is, right? So anyway, I hope you guys liked it. Let me know what you think. Peace. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please check me out on patreon.com at Kevin and Bass, where you can donate and make this podcast possible. Also check me out on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, where you can find my latest thoughts on the latest controversies and findings within health science. Also check me out at The Kevin Bass Show, both on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. I hope this podcast was useful to you. If it was, please leave me a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. See you guys in the next episode.